Shall we start, sir?
We can start now.
A very good evening to all of you. Law Essential welcomes you in the 10th edition of webinar on legal analysis of the recent barbaric attacks on animals. Law Essential builds the community of lifelong learners by bridging the gap between where we are and where we want to go. I am Gurleen Kaur, legal editor at Law Essentials and a student of UPES Dehradun. We are glad to introduce the speaker for today's session, Mr. Abhayraj Naik. He is an advisor, consultant, and educator co-founder at Initiative of Climate Action. He is also a visiting faculty at NLSIU Bangalore and Azim Premji University. Let me introduce the moderator for today's session, Mohammad Faransi. He is a founder at Law Essentials and a student at St. Joseph College of Law, Bengaluru. So here we go ahead with the much awaited event. Over to you, Farhan.
Thank you, Gurleen, for that very warm introduction. Thank you, sir, for taking your valuable time out and joining with us today. I switch over to you, and you can now switch over to your presentation, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Just checking, am I audible? Is it coming across clear enough?
Yes, sir, perfectly.
Okay, fantastic. So, good evening. Thank you everyone for being here. Let me start off by thanking Law Essentials for inviting me for this and also congratulating them for this absolutely wonderful venture. Nothing pleases my heart more than seeing young learners speak about lifelong learning and actively take steps to facilitate lifelong learning for the larger community. So I've been invited to speak with you all today on a topic that many of you all have thought about, perhaps in and through recent incidents that have grabbed the public spotlight, but if not, have felt connected with simply by virtue of being part of a society and a culture where animals feature very prominently in our food, in our religion, in our iconography, in our popular culture, and in our sense of what's cool and what's not, in our sense of style, right? So, even if we haven't spoken about or thought about the law relating to animals, I suspect everybody has at one stage or the other encountered an animal or experienced something that might have left an impression of being animal like in their imagination, right? So before I proceed any further, I must in good conscience apologize for the slightly late start of this session. It wasn't the folks at Law Essentials responsible for that, but entirely me, as I got here directly from another meeting. And let me now take you to the heart of my comments today. And I'm hoping to have some good interaction with you, either through questions or through comments, once I've had a chance to share some of my own thoughts and comments with all of you. Now, I was just commenting with my two young colleagues a short while back that my presentation today is very unlike my usual presentations. My deck, my slide deck, is not colorful. It doesn't have too many pictures, and in fact, it has no pictures. And unlike what I've been told in this sort of long history of learning how to create good presentations, I've ignored that advice and included a lot of text today, right? And my excuse, if at all you'll accept it, is that I hope through the session to really get to the heart of what I understand by law's essentials as a name and respond to the terms of reference that were given to me, which was can you legally analyze the recent barbaric attacks, particularly the attack against the elephant, the attack against the cow, and the attack against the jackal in Kerala, Himachal Pradesh, and where was the jackal? And possibly Orissa, if I'm not mistaken, which have all grabbed public attention, not least because the manner of attack, using an explosive hidden within food that the animal consumed, has sort of really uh, shocked the conscience of the nation and shocked the conscience of many, many popular influencers, including actors, sports people, politicians, so on and so forth, right? So when I was asked, can you speak about these barbaric attacks and speak about them uh, through legal analysis, I felt it was my duty to really bring to this presentation not just my opinions on these cases, but also a deep history, context, and culture to how one might frame issues such as this at a time such as this in a country such as this, right? So that's why, unlike most of my presentations, today's presentation is in the academic mode, right? And it is a presentation that has drawn heavily from a chapter that I've published recently with my partner, Rachel Chenchaya, as part of a book that was very recently released by Oxford University Press called Law and Violence in India. And our chapter gets into this question of animals and violence in an interdisciplinary and in an imaginative way, right? So through this session or through this talk, I basically want to make 5 points for you, right? And I'm going to urge you to think about these points, consider these points, and reflect on what these points actually mean to you as a law student, as a researcher interested in the law, as a practicing lawyer, as a teacher of law or the social sciences, or as a conscientious, concerned citizen living in a democracy that has a constitution and follows the rule of law. Point number one, I suggest that the current barbaric attacks, and I put barbaric attacks within single quotes as you'll see, on animals are not as simple as they first appear. They are actually messy social phenomena in a complex, unequal world that raise more questions rather than cry for easy answers. And you'll see what I mean by this in just a second. Second, I used this session to suggest that thinking about animals philosophically, legally, culturally, and emotionally is very, very important for some big questions in the world of knowledge, including the world of philosophy and law. Third, I take you on a rapid whirlwind tour of animal law in India, without which we cannot really carry out a legal analysis of these recent attacks. Fourth, I suggest what might be the key problems with animal law in India as it exists today, and thereby hint at where the pathways or solutions might be found. And fifth, in an infuriating fashion perhaps for some of you, I once again resist easy answers. This is what we need to do. The people who put the firecracker into the pineapple need to get to the death penalty. We need to pass a new law that hangs all people who kill animals. I resist such what I call easy solutions that are made more for the newspapers rather than for law in terms of how it operates in society. And I suggest what are the key reflective questions that we are left to deal with, right? And my suggestion is it'll be a journey that we will have to carry out together to arrive at answers to these questions, rather than a switch we press and hope that, lo and behold, the world is transformed. So, what do I mean by the current barbaric attacks on animals are messy social phenomenon in a complex, unequal world? Right? Now, most of you would have come to this session perhaps thinking that, hey, that pregnant elephant, that jackal, that cow, they suffered terribly. They suffered through an action that at first blush seems mindless. The law should check such an injustice. How can the law respond to this injustice and prevent future such injustices? Right? That would perhaps have been the frame within which you approach this session. And I would from the get go like to complicate that narrative using what the famous French post structuralist philosopher Michel Foucault has beautifully described as a problematization technique. I would like to suggest that it's not as simple as that, right? Let's take the example of the jackal, right? In the case of the jackal, and I have just newspaper accounts that I've quickly looked at, you had a group of 9 to 12 men who, while they were out looking for honey, noticed a jackal roaming around in that forested area at the borders of civilization. These men, being adept in hunting and coming from a nomadic group of people, decided that the meat of the jackal, along with the teeth of the jackal, would be both useful for them. They could sell the meat, they could eat the meat, they could use the teeth of the jackal to make trinkets and ornaments that they could then sell. So they took some pieces of meat, put what is referred to as an onion bomb, an aloo bomb. There are different ways of referring to these firecrackers inside the meat, and left pieces of that meat in places where they could see traces of the jackal or where they had actually seen the jackal. The jackal, of course, ate the meat. The firecracker exploded. The jackal died. The men found the body of the jackal, put it into a bag, went and got themselves a cup of tea at the local shop, when who comes by but a constable who is suspicious about these men and suspicious about what's in the bag that they're carrying, and looking in discovers that there is an animal protected under Schedule 1, if I'm not mistaken, of the Wildlife Protection Act of India, dead, killed, murdered in the bag. Right? Now, if you read behind the subtext of this story, a few questions begin to emerge. Who are these people who are still hunting animals in India, where we have modern cars, 5G networks, Zoom breakout rooms, Swiggy and Zomato, and all these wonders of modern civilization? Who are these people who are hunting and eating predators such as jackals, right? And you'll discover that these people are tribal ethnic minorities who quite often in history have been identified as criminal tribes. Next, you might ask, why is it that these people are so hungry or so poor that they have to kill animals? Hmm? Do they not have jobs? Do they not have a public distribution shop? Do they not have plentiful in their bank? Right? And third, you might ask, how is it that this policeman saw a bunch of men drinking tea and decided to look into their bag? Was the bag stained in blood? Was there a smell coming? Or did he just look at these people and say, these tribal chaps are always up to mischief. Let me look in their bag and see what's in there. Right? And in this rendering of the story, suddenly it's no longer just about that poor jackal that was killed, but it is also about tribes, equality, ethnicity, suspicion and fairness of the state, including the colonial state, and poverty, right? And I would suggest each of these three stories, the elephant, the cow, and the jackal, have all these complicated actors, right? Why are people putting explosive pineapples next to their fields, right? It's obvious that they're protecting their fields from someone or something. Wild boars, as we discovered, or bulls or bison in the case of the elephant from Kerala. Why is it that they don't have money to actually fence their fields? Why is it that they are usually not beneficiaries of what we understand as a formal education in the Indian education system? Is it right to think of them purely as barbarians, and therefore the barbaric attack gets problematized? Can you think of them as struggling to make a livelihood? Can you think of them as forgotten illegal citizens of the Indian constitutional state? Can you think of them as desperate seekers of the Indian welfare system? And I suggest each of these questions is important if you really want to get to the root of how to prevent cruel, painful attacks on animals in India today. The next question, the animal question, for me, is one of the most important questions in the domain of law and philosophy, right? And this is because for almost 3,000 years of philosophy as we've known it, this troubling separation between human and animal has troubled the minds of the smartest people we know and the brightest legal systems that have ever originated, right? Even today, we go back full circle when we start giving animals rights, right? We go back to a time in ancient Greek history, a pre Socratic time, where someone called Diogenes thought of himself as a dog, where he was comfortable uh, being left out of the city. And he said that my only condition when I die is make sure that you feed my body to the animals, right? And this is a famous philosopher who we have forgotten because we remember only Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, right? And the suggestion here, and this is a really deep point on which thinkers, legal philosophers, and pure philosophers, cultural theorists have spent thousands of hours and have covered thousands of pages. The suggestion is that only by going back to how we are animal or not animal do we really understand what it means to be a human being, right? And here I'm reminded of Mahatma Gandhi's famous saying that many of us are familiar with. The true measure of a civilization is how it treats its animals, right? A more detailed look at Gandhian philosophy will see that the true swabhav of the human for Gandhi requires a sort of unwavering equality with all life, right? And those of you all who knows Gandhi's stories might know about the snakes in the ashram, the monkeys, the dying cow that he had to encounter. His life is replete with stories, right? The final thinker I'll mention for those who are interested in more than the law, in that from which the law itself originates, right? The French philosopher Derrida has perhaps the most rich account of what it means to be a human who thinks of the animal as something different, right? And this might sound shocking, but Derrida describes his craziest moment when he's standing face to face. He's naked in his bathroom, and his pet cat is looking at him. And Derrida's poetic words describe that moment when he's looking into the eyes of this living being that is living, that is mammalian, but is still so completely other that everything he knows about what is right and wrong, what is human and what is not human, where the limit lies, all of that begins to dissolve and get complicated again. So let me proceed to my next few slides here, because I'm going to get into the questions of what is animal law in India, what are the problems with animal law in India, and what does it all mean, and where do we go from here in and through these slides. But I hope my first 2 points have hit home at least partially. One, let's talk about these barbaric attacks, recognizing the pain, trauma, and suffering that innocent animal encountered at the hands of human beings. But let's also not ignore that death, that murder, that violence, that barbaric attack occurred within a larger social context that implicated many things, including poverty, inequality, difference, ethnicity, and the duties of the constitutional state. Let's also recognize that if we allow ourselves to actually think of the question, I'm reminded of one of my students. He was a master student in Sonipat, Haryana, studying at an LLM at the Jindal Law School. While we were talking about veganism, he was like, he was a vegetarian, of course. I'm not a vegetarian, I should just disclose. But he was like, there is this account that what you eat, you become like that. And therefore, I don't want to be a vegetarian. I don't want to become like a goat or like a sheep or like a cow or like a chicken. And he had this expression on his face, right? And I'm reminded of him when I think about this, because the animal question is at the heart of the human question, right? How we think of animal rights will decide the frontiers of human rights. And those are the two initial points I'd like to present to you, not justify fully, but present as possible suggestions that are worth thinking about. So let's read what the philosopher Mary Midgley says, and I love her language here, right? Recent advances in ethology, which is the science of animal behavior, have renewed social science interest in human relations with animals. Even as historically, human imagination has always occupied itself with the other species, right? Why does Ganesha have an elephant's head? Why do the ancient Egyptian gods have the head of a fox or the wings of a bird, the claws of an eagle? Historically, human imagination has always occupied itself with other species. This is a language, a symbolic link that is more direct, more primary, a symbolic function that has not lapsed. The ambivalence we feel about civilization is expressed in our attitudes to wild and domesticated animals, right? I'm reminded of the story of Tulsi Das here, right? Who steps into a river to take a bath, and he sees, along with his companions, the glimmering eyes of a crocodile just a few meters away from him, right? And immediately his companions step back in fright, and Tulsidas also begins to step back when somewhere his training kicks in, and he says, if I believe what I believe, me and that crocodile are the same life, and there is nothing for me to move back from. And he continues with his path, right? His attitude towards that wild animal comes out in that story that gets immortalized. And so, in both cases, how we treat wild animals and how we treat domesticated animals, right? I, for example, get really angry with my partner because we have two dogs and we've had many cats in our house. I don't like to think of my dogs and cats as my children, right? But my partner is constantly saying, you're the daddy to these dogs. And we have different relations to domesticated animals, right? In both cases, it is our motives, habitually symbolized by these two kinds of animal, that are really in question. Now, let's get to the stuff that you've all really come here for in the first place, right? What's the law relating to animals in India? Number one, the Indian Constitution, which imposes duties on the state and private individuals. Recently, in and through case law from the Supreme Court and a few high courts in India, the Indian Constitution also, though I have argued, including in a recent piece and seminar called Law's Nature, that weakly so, the Indian Constitution also provides rights for animals, right? Especially through Justice Radhakrishnan's uh, phenomenal jurisprudence that culminated in the well known Jallikattu case. Second, the Indian Penal Code, our criminal law from 1860, criminalizes mischief against animals. Third, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, tracing back to the 60s, is probably the best known law that deals with the cruel treatment of animals in India. Right? It's important to note here that the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act usually covers domestic and not wild animals. So that itself is a uncertain area in the law relating to animals. And fourth, the Wildlife Protection Act, which properly deals with non-domesticated animals, with wildlife, which regulates the treatment of wild animals in India. Right? So Constitution, Indian Penal Code, the PCA, and the WPA. All of this is national, central, right? We're a federal country. India also has state, regional, and local law that are specific to particular animals or specific to certain territories. And finally, the good lawyer, the good law student will also recognize international law, particularly treaty law, that applies. India is a signatory and has ratified these treaties that applies to certain animals. And CITES, the Convention on Elimination on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Animals, is the best known. But other treaties would be the Convention on Biological Diversity. I beg your pardon, the IUCN and the IWC and UNESCO are not necessarily treaties, though there are conventions that regulate and guide the formation and operation of these international organizations. Now, it's important at first blush to acknowledge that the Constitution, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, and the Wildlife Protection Act, along with all these other state specific laws, government orders, delegated legislation, bylaws, and notifications that deal with animals in many contexts, including wildlife conservation, laboratory testing, livestock and domestic pet breeding, performances, slaughterhouses, scientific labs, so on and so forth. Right? Quick history: the first laws that relate to animals were enacted by the British, the Indian Forest Acts of 1865 and 1878, the Madras Forest Act of 1873. We must note that the initial laws relating to forests were not so concerned with the life of animals within the forests, but were more focused on dealing with how to commercialize the resources of the forest, that is, the wood of the forest, and sometimes the animal produce of the forest, including honey, some meat, some skins. Uh, the Elephant Preservation Act, the Wild Birds Protection Act, and the Wild Birds and Animal Protection Act, all dating to the late 19th century and the early 20th century, were our first early legislations, while still under British rule, that dealt specifically with animals. Right? Related laws, for example, the 1897 Indian Fisheries Act, also had an implication on animals such as the fish by regulating particularly damaging, and it's interesting to see, use of explosives was there in Indian law as early as the 1897 Indian Fisheries Act in the context of its impact on animals. Right? Now, in general, the British government's approach towards forest, wildlife, and natural resources of India was a utilitarian approach. They were interested in what efficiency could be generated from these resources, and they weren't too interested in the life, well-being, or the rights of animals. Right? There's a twist there which I'll come to in just a second. The Indian subcontinent had to wait until 1936 before the first national park, which is the current day Jim Corbett National Park in Uttarakhand, was established. Now, here's the twist I mentioned. The Indian Penal Code, which, as you might know, traces back to 1860, has what is perhaps the most comprehensive uh, account in criminal law at that time in history relating to animals. Right? Now, the Indian Penal Code itself was drafted by Thomas Macaulay, and Thomas Macaulay was greatly inspired by the English utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham and his idea of utility, which most people understand as do that which will give the maximum benefit for the maximum number. Right? Bentham is also famous for saying it's not whether they think, it's not whether they speak, it's whether they suffer. And he was talking about animals, right? And therefore, Benthamite ideas allowed for Macaulay to bring in provisions in the Indian Penal Code that continue to this day and which I argue are actually the strongest provisions we have to deal with these three cases of the killing of the elephant, the killing of the jackal, and the killing or the injuring of the cow, because they criminalize the killing or maiming of animals. Now, we should note that in the Indian Penal Code, and this is of particular relevance for the Himachal Pradesh case, that the killing or maiming of cattle is a most serious offense with the penalty of a fine or imprisonment up to 5 years. Right? Whereas non-cattle killing or maiming has imprisonment up to 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. Right? So those are the sections, section 428 and section 429. Any lawyer who's interested in going to court should use these sections and should uncover these sections. Law clinics and law students and animal activists who are interested in protecting the rights of animals should get the police to register charge sheets on these sections, right? Because these are hugely underused in India. Mischief or killing or maiming of cattle, mischief or killing or maiming of animal, right? And there is, you note, a value attached. So some kinds of animal and cattle, which are not worth even 10 rupees or 50 rupees, will arguably not get the protection of these sections. And this is not a trivial point because animals such as hyenas, wolves, jackals, wild boars are often categorized as vermin, which have zero value and where the state often gives you money to kill. Right? Now, the utilitarian approach to animals has continued from the British times to independent India's times. And the directive principles of state policy, in particular in the Indian Constitution, require the value, recognize, I beg your pardon, the value of scientific animal husbandry, and again emphasize the value of cattle, which many people trace back to India being an agrarian economy, and it's led to loads of contestation, complication, and controversy. Is it fair for cow slaughter legislations to be there in place? So, what if India is predominantly Hindu? Isn't it a secular country? What about Islamic communities or Buddhist communities that think of beef as a ritual food? What about Dalit populations that depend on this food for their protein intake? Lots of controversy, and I'm not going to get into detail in that in this talk, but note here that the initial constitution of the Republic of India, apart from the directive principles, only had one other mention to animals, which was entry 17 in the concurrent list of the seventh schedule, right? Which was the prevention of cruelty to animals. Now, the next point to note that it is only in the 1976, amendments, and that point in history is important to note. Okay, post emergency, when the constitution gets amended to bring about a duty of the state to protect and improve the environment and safeguard the country's wildlife and forests, and a duty for citizens to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, rivers, and wildlife. And get this bit, this is possibly my favorite phrase in the Indian constitution, and to have compassion for living creatures, right? Not to be found in any other constitution in the world. Simultaneously, forests and protection of wild animals and birds are introduced into the concurrent list, right? The fundamental duty of citizens to be compassionate towards living creatures has been subsequently relied upon by lawyers and judges at both the High Court and Supreme Court level to trace out, still weak, but it's been traced out, to trace out both duties for the state and very, very recently, nascent rights, almost equal to fundamental rights for animals in India. Right? Again, please remember, whoever you are, if you're thinking about law in India relating to animals, you have to read the entire edifice together: international law, constitutional law, national legislations, possibility of states enacting their own legislations, and a whole host of delegated legislation. These are your sources. Then you have your institutional architecture, the high courts, the Supreme Court, the animal welfare boards, your non-state actors, your PETA, your CUPA, your residence welfare associations, and all of those together create the system that actually impacts the life of the animal. Now, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act is particularly important and is rightly famous, right? Because it is the most detailed act dealing with cruelty to animals. And what happened to the pregnant elephant, the cow, and the jackal is undoubtedly cruelty, right? Note that the PCA deals with all kinds of situations of possible cruelty to animals, including impermissible uses of performing animals, the employment of aged and diseased animals in work, laboratory testing of certain kinds, mutilation and killing of animals. Certainly, that provision is attracted in this case, and it imposes monetary fines with the possibility of imprisonment for violations. Right? Even more specific, what is the cruelty? Beating, kicking, overdriving, use of an unfit animal for work, administering injurious drugs, transport in a manner causing pain or suffering, confining in cages, chaining or tethering for long durations, failure to exercise a chained dog, abandoning animals, use of animals as bait, animal fighting, use of animals released from captivity for shooting, etc. Right? And beating, kicking, overdriving, etc. will also cover what we've seen in these kinds of cases, is my suggestion. Right? The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act is the mother legislation. Under it, a number of specific rules have also been issued, particularly rules related to scientific experimentation, animal slaughter, animals in film, use of animals for cosmetic testing. Uh, Along with, there are no rules on this, but the PCA itself deals with sacrifice of animals for ritualistic religious purposes. Now, it's important to get a little bit of history on the PCA. It was introduced in 1961, and this is something that's really not known by most people who are interested in animals and animal law. When the PCA was originally introduced, it was drafted by Rukmini Devi Arundale, a dancer from Madras. And Arundale's version of the PCA called for a ban on animal experimentation and, get this, a ban on slaughter of animals for food. Right? Now, Mr. Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, who we are all familiar with, told Miss Arundale, don't worry, it's a beautiful law, I will introduce it. And sneakily, Mr. Nehru introduced a bill that had two key changes, right? It basically reversed Miss Arundale's ban on animal experimentation, and it reversed Miss Arundale's ban on the slaughter of animals for food, right? And this was brought to my attention by the scholarship of the anthropologist Naisargi Dave, based in Canada. India also enacted the Wildlife Protection Act in 1972 that certainly applies to the jackal. There are schedules in the WPA. The WPA is not limited to animals and birds, but it also applies to plants. So something like sandalwood, if you're interested in, look for it in the WPA. The WPA basically is a comprehensive legislation with its own institutional processes and hierarchy, regulating hunting, ownership, sale, purchase, trade, etc., and prescribes penalties for offenses. Finally, an underexplored law, the Biological Diversity Act of 2002, still not finding enough mention in court, right? It provides for conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the use of biological resources. And I suspect in the next 20 years, this legislation will really begin to feature more in our courts. So I'm aware that I'm almost at the end of my time. So let me quickly move to the end of my presentation. Now, in the context of the present uh, barbaric attacks, it's interesting to go back to what Justice Radhakrishnan has done through a number of decisions: the Chhattisgarh Buffalo decision, the Gir Lion case, the Red Sanders case, and most recently, the Jallikattu case, where in all of these cases, he's advocated and mandated that Indian law in general must be ecocentric and has created the foundation for animal rights that are akin to fundamental human rights in India. The substance of these animal rights, which are like fundamental rights, and at the moment they're still weak. Unfortunately, Justice Radhakrishnan's spirit and motivation were good, but his reasoning and his ability to work within the confines of the fixed language of the constitution were limited, right? But what these rights basically are: right to live in a healthy and clean atmosphere, right to get food and shelter, the right to dignity and fair treatment. That pregnant elephant standing in that river, waiting for her death, knowing that the unborn baby within her would never live, certainly didn't have a right to dignity, right? That cow with its jaw blown off certainly didn't have its right to dignity respected. And then a very clear: the right not to be beaten, kicked, overridden, overloaded, and the right not to be tortured, and against unnecessary pain and suffering. That unnecessary pain and suffering is the same language from the Prevention of Cruelty Against Animals Act, right? Unfortunately, the law against India continues to be blind to numerous cases of violence against animals, including factory farming for food, laboratory testing, animals in cultural sports, including cockfighting, being some classic examples. Right? The more subtle way in which the law is absolutely inadequate to protect animals is simply because the law does not protect the habitat of animals, wild animals, right? And our latest EIA laws, or even the auction of coal mines in some of the most densely forested and biodiverse areas of India, show you how rotten the system is, where the habitat of animals is entirely unprotected, right? Finally, the thinker Dinesh Wadiwell has characterized this as a war against animals, right? Because it is literally billions of animals that are being killed by us in conditions that are not too different from how the Nazis treated their victims, right? For those of y'all who didn't know, wild animals occupy only 3% of the weight of animals in the world today, right? The other 97% is human beings and animals that human beings rear for their own consumption and use. 3%, right? What a tragedy. And anyone who's read Harari's work will see that the history of humanity is a history of destroying species of animals, right? Which is why, not surprisingly, we are in this present age. Some of you might call it Kali Yuga, other climate activists call it the period of sixth extinction, where we are losing species of animals every day. Unfortunately, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act simply is inadequate in its punishment, right? These figures might have changed, it might have moved up, but I think they're still the same. The maximum fine is 100 rupees. Who cares about 100 rupees, right? 100 rupees to kill a pregnant elephant, right? And these fines unfortunately have not been revised from the 1960s, though there might be a more recent revision than reflected here. In contrast, the IPC provisions are significantly stronger, right? Up to 2 years or up to 5 years, depending on whether it's cattle or not, along with a fine of suitable amount. Which is why I'll always advocate, see if you can uncover the IPC provisions if you're actually interested in animal litigation or animal activism. And this requires sensitizing the police, because the police otherwise will refuse to file your FIR. They will deny the FIR, right? Um, Another challenge is the plurality of laws. There are so many laws at the national level, at the state level, at the local level, at the international level, that, like with many other areas of law in India, everyone is finally confused about who's responsible. Hmm? I'm reminded of the Ramanujam's fantastic essay in the Economic and Political Weekly. Is there an Indian way of thinking? Yeah, there is an Indian way of legal thinking for the state, which says it's not my responsibility, it's that guy's responsibility. And that unfortunately imperils our animals, right? Uh, the overall ineffectiveness of the law is, of course, coupled with a general disinclination to take seriously cruelty against animals. Unfortunately, we do not record, we do not monitor offenses against animals. It is not there in the crime figures that are captured by the national government. And this is problematic for many reasons, not least because some psychological research indicates that cruelty against animals is an indication of subsequent cruelty or simultaneous cruelty against other human beings, right? It's a truth that judges in India are not trained or prepared to effectively adjudicate complex issues concerning animals and animal rights. And this extends all the way from your trial court to your Supreme Court and your National Green Tribunal, right? And even the what I consider a visionary judge such as Radhakrishnan, on reading a judgment, and I won't blame his knowledge or training here, I'll also indicate the lack of time within which a Indian judge operates. The judgment itself is not sufficiently drawing from ethology, philosophy, cultural studies. It's still lacking that richness, which you're beginning to see in some legal decisions from other countries. Right? I'll skip this slide. But please, and I'll end here, coming back to what does the present barbaric wave really mean for us, right? In the history of philosophy, there have been two ways about thinking about animal rights, right? One is the American and the British tradition, which the Indian tradition is also following, which is primarily about the ethical status of non-human animals, the question of whether animals deserve equal rights. Should they have human rights of some form, right? By contrast, the continental European tradition, and here I'm referring to the French, Italian, Spanish, arguably certain indigenous traditions from South America as well, they're not so interested in the question of are animals equal to us or should they have rights, but they're actually interested in whether we are animals who have forgotten our animality, which allows us to continue living in barbaric ways. And how does recognizing our animality, a simple recognition that, like that jackal, like that cow, we too will live, we too will die, we too have an end date, hmm? We too breathe, we too piss, we too shit, we too feel pain, right? A recognition of that animality, which Darwin reminded us of, what does that do to bring back the humanity that is possible for us, right? Maybe once we recognize that we are indeed animals, we'll start treating other animals with care. So, what does this mean for people who want to respond? Basically, it means you really need to be radical in your imagination of what is possible through animal law, right? You need to go all the way to the constitution, you need to go all the way to stories within Indian religions and tradition. You can invoke the god Ganesha if it helps you, but you certainly need to do the hard work of filing cases, supporting activists, sensitizing the police, following the case all the way through to its logical conclusion, reopening the case if it's not implemented, because we are a long way from what Gandhi called or what Gandhi hinted at as a correct civilizational ethos, right? And modernity has not helped us, unfortunately. We are continue to be one of the biggest exporters of meat and milk in the world. So I would suggest, in conclusion, that the law really de-animalizes animals. It does not actually identify animals as they are. It has what Derrida has called effigies of animals, animots, okay? And it just deals with a few arbitrary risks and cruelties here and there, which is why I'm not with Anushka Sharma and other celebrities who are making such a brouhaha about this elephant and this jackal and this cow, right? Every day, millions of animals die under the most excruciating circumstances in India. And I think if you really want to change how we think of animals, you'll have to recognize that what's on your fork, or what's pulling your cart, or what is dying because your car is belching out air is also that same animal, right? So I'll end on that provocative note. Hopefully, we still have time for some questions and comments. I hope I got some of you thinking about some things.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. We have got questions coming in from the audience. We have the first question coming in from Mahalakshmi Agarwal. She asks, "Sir, what do you think as a common person? What can we do to prevent such attacks?"
Thank you. I think what one can always do is to recognize injustice when it happens and respond to it, right? So the one thing that you can immediately do is, if it doesn't threaten your physical safety, speak out, right? Especially if you are a lawyer or a law student and you have no reason to believe you will be immediately attacked, it's worthwhile intervening, right? That's when you're seeing an attack happening right before you. At a larger level, the solution always comes back to awareness and education. How can you, as a common person, make your neighbor, your friend, your parent, your teacher, your student, uh, your domestic help, your cousin living in the other town, uh, how can you just generally make people about you aware of how this is an ethical issue, how this is an issue that reflects on what it means to be a human? How I work in the environmental area, right? Our sort of hypothesis is if we make sustainability sexy, if we make it cool, a lot of people will start being sustainable. Right now, it's not cool or sexy. It's like it's better to have a nice gas guzzling SUV and fly wherever you want to and order as much as you want from Zomato and so on and so forth, right? So if we can make animal equality or compassion towards animals culturally desirable, hmm, that will motivate a lot of people. And yes, I think as lawyers, in a few paradigm cases, I'm no total softie. In a few paradigm cases, people must be punished, right? And uh, if it's a complicated situation, the complexity must be recognized. But there are many cruel people who are not tribal, who are not poor, who are not trying hunting to feed their stomach. They are just out and out cruel, right? And technology captures these. So some paradigm cases of punishment through law must also happen. I hope that helps, Mala.
I would also like to remind the audience that you can pose in your questions by putting them in the chat box. We have the next question coming in from Vaiga. So, could you comment on how can we blend the idea of animal rights into the existing jurisprudence of law? In which theory can we maximize animal rights?
Thank you. That's Vaiga, a good question and a difficult question. So the correct answer to that question is, which jurisprudence of law is operating in the system within which you are located or within which you are asking this question, right? So if you're asking this question at an all India level and it's a general question, the existing jurisprudence of law that continues to operate in India is a brand of utilitarianism with a little social welfare provisioning, right? So, there, the Benthamite approach of coming up with rights for animals based on sentience or similarity to human beings is more likely to get traction. But I would say context always matters, right? If the judge or the audience before which you're arguing has a totally different jurisprudence, let's say they have a, a Kautilian or a Dharmic jurisprudence, right? Can you pick up stories from Hindu scriptures that maybe Yudhishthira and the dog story, right? Or some of the beautiful narratives around the Ashwamedha sacrifice and the significance of that horse, or the Ganesha story, as I mentioned, right? Or all the winged steeds and so on and so forth. That might be useful as a jurisprudential account. So, my sense of jurisprudence is quite fluid, right? If a natural law account of jurisprudence operates with this judge or with this law, you want to say that yes, all life inalienably has rights, including the right not to be tortured, right? So I would suggest that there is no one jurisprudence, there are multiple jurisprudences. And as a researcher and student of Indian law for what is close to 2 decades now, uh, I think one can't say that there is only one jurisprudence that operates in India, right? So the Forest Rights Act of 2005 and the Right to Information Act of 2005 are coming from a very different jurisprudence than the Indian Penal Code of 1860. But both of these laws are together a part of the legal system of India. So maybe final word would be the critical legal studies approach would also be a natural fit to bring in animal rights, right? Because once you're a critical legal studies scholar, researcher, student, you are basically critiquing power, right? You are critiquing entrenched inequalities. You're critiquing the lie of the system, which makes us think that that KFC burger is all beautiful and does not involve uh, chicken having their beaks chopped off, etc. And don't get me wrong, I'm not an advocate for vegetarianism or veganism, though I have been a vegan and really liked my life as a vegan. I'm back to eating meat and I enjoy eating meat now. But I am totally opposed to factory farming and the cruelty that happens in farming today.
So we have the next question from Ravneet Kaur. So could you tell what steps can be taken by a layman regarding the cruel videos of the animals which is being shared on social media platforms?
Thank you. That's a interesting question, and to be honest, I've not fully thought through it. But let me just think this scenario through with you, Ravneet. So one is, I think the first step is always investigate a little bit more. Has the person who has uploaded the video taken the video, right? And in that sense, you already know if that person was in that situation or not. Quite often, it is impossible to say even this. If you have any reason to believe that the person who has uploaded the video has taken the video, and there is what appears to be a crime that has been committed by so and so person, uh, you could, uh, depending on how much energy you have and what you want to do, you could file a complaint in a police station. You could invoke the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act or the Indian Penal Code. Uh, you could also write to the platform where the video has been uploaded if your purpose is to get rid of the video and not really to punish the person who did that, and point out to the platform. It could be a Facebook, it could be a Twitter, it could be an Insta. Point out that what is in that video violates some provision of Indian law, right? It either violates an animal specific law, or it is a video that violates some other provision of the Indian Penal Code. It is a provision, it is a video that causes offense, that is likely to generate enmity, that uh, 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 promotes violence, right? That could be one other thing you could do. I think, most importantly, coming back to my culture point, uh, if you have tough skin and you can take the online battle, you should shame people who are making fun of animals being treated cruelly and videos that are depicting cruel treatment of animals, right? Finally, I mean, I have a friend, one of my classmates from law school. He gave up his sort of very lucrative job. He became a farmer in Mysore, and he spends all his time on Facebook fighting different kinds of cruelties, right? Including bigoted thinking, animal cruelty, and let's not assume there is no value in doing even that, right? Because finally, it is in and through these small acts that big battles are won. Maybe you change someone's mind, maybe you inspire someone else. As far as possible, try not to take it to the level of that which you are targeting, right? So see if you can do it in a way that's polite, that's nonetheless firm. But I know from experience that's not easy. You'll always be met by other attacks. Hope some of that is helpful for you.
So we have the next question coming in from Shivani Biju. The Supreme Court directed the different states to set up animal welfare boards, but not all the states have actually set them up. What is your view in this, sir?
Thank you, Shivani. So I must confess ignorance in answering this question. To be honest, I do not know the exact status of the animal welfare boards at the state level. I do know that animal welfare boards, including the one in Karnataka, the state within which I live, are operating. My general sense, and I have to confess that I have not done this research, so I would be wary of making any sweeping statement. But my general sense is that the animal welfare boards, uh, every now and then, even within the state level, do espouse the cause of animal welfare and prevention of cruelty. But I just think that they are, at the end of the day, fairly powerless organizations, and therefore it's good that Justice Radhakrishnan, in the Jallikattu case, once again tried to amplify the importance of the Animal Welfare Board. Uh, the big answer is, in general, I am quite cynical and skeptical about the integrity and efficiency of many of our environmental and animal related institutional architectures. As I said, I am a radical here. For me, the whole system is quite rotten. Even uh, environmental boards, or take the Central Water Commission, or take the Animal Welfare Board, all of these are captured by yes men and yes women who usually will not uh, uh, sort of have the spine to stand up to both government and uh, big capital.
The next question reads, do you think the law should be made more stringent in order to deter the citizens?
Thank you. I think the law in the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act should be made more stringent in terms of punishments. I also think coming up with uh, more and more specific legislation with specific punishments is well and good. However, I don't think that is the solution that we are looking for, simply because laws don't work automatically. Laws need to be implemented. And what everyone keeps running away from, including a lot of law teachers I know and a lot of law students I meet, is that the implementation does not feature within legal analysis. So we are more interested in interpreting what does concur with mean consent with, and we'll spend 1,000 pages on that. But we are not interested in actually looking at how much money was spent, how many people were employed, what was the money spent on, what actually happened on the ground, right? So without monitoring and implementation, changing the law is useless. And just let's look at the rape laws that have come in after even the Nirbhaya case, right? The most recent criminal law amendment. Have rapes significantly stopped or changed in India? No, right? So just changing the law is never an answer. You need to think of the implementation, and you need to build capacity. And that means budgets, that means training, that means opening up hitherto sacred governmental offices to citizen participation and academic participation, right? Unfortunately, we call ourselves the independent republic of India, but a lot of our mindset, especially in how the bureaucracy and the official institutions run, is still very colonial.
We have the next question coming from Abhinav Anand. The rural infrastructure in India, in terms of the treatment of animals, are inadequate. Could you please share your views on that, sir?
Thank you. I appreciate your question. Here again, I can't claim to be an expert because I don't really have facts and figures relating to the rural infrastructure in relation to treatment of animals. But I have spent some time in rural parts of India and have seen that veterinary hospitals are usually understaffed, under budget, and quite often uh, simply incapable of dealing with complex cases involving animals. That said, I would suspect that quite often it is in rural India that you find the best veterinarians and the most committed protectors of animal rights, right? And I don't know if any of y'all have read the stories of James Herriot, who writes delightfully on animals. I mean, all of his stories are as a vet in rural England, right? And it's another matter that Indian vets don't write stories simply because sometimes they don't know how to write, or no one told them that their stories can actually really inspire a lot of people. But I suspect a lot of the best people, the best knowledge, not necessarily the best technology and best facilities, are in rural India. Because in urban India, uh, you're just dealing with cats and dogs in most vet hospitals, right? We are obsessed with our cats and dogs. So our birds, our snakes, our insects, our other urban wildlife that we find in the cities, uh, you know, uh, the vets quite often don't know how to deal with them, though exceptions are there in some cities as well, including the city I live in, where a few non-profits function excellently. I think, Mr. Anand, the question deserves more research. That is, how much budget is allocated for animal treatment, and I would be interested in knowing those facts and figures. How many hospitals are there? How many doctors are there? How many cases are there? I think it's certainly deserving of state specific and national level study. Thank you for the question.
Jayant asks if there can be some mechanism like a PIL to address animal issues in India.
Thank you, Jayant. Yes, they absolutely can, and they have been. So make no mistake, I didn't cover the PILs except in passing, but uh, some of the most dramatic advances in Indian law relating to animals have come via the PIL route, right? The Jallikattu case, which I keep referring to, the Nagaraja versus Union of India case, decided initially by the Supreme Court in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, but which is still complicated and continues in different forms today, was a PIL. I mean, the 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 Gir line case was a PIL about objecting to the translocation of the lines from Gujarat to Madhya Pradesh, or requiring the translocation, right? The original petition in the Kerala High Court that led to the amendment in the Prevention of Cruelties Act that removed bears and panthers, etc., from circuses was the PIL. The judgment in the Delhi High Court that related to birds that were in pet shops and were often captured there or trapped there was a PIL. If I'm not mistaken, the Sansar Chand case, that was not a PIL, that was a criminal appeal. So, yes, many uh, good PILs have already been there. Sometimes PILs are also very politicized, especially the PILs that relate to animals and food, right? Particularly because once you talk about meat in India, religion and caste both get implicated, right? There also was a recent judgment about kurbani or sacrifice, which the court declined to get into, if I'm not mistaken. And there are some organizations, I know, Humane Society International, the India office, they provide some help with PILs. The National Law School in Hyderabad, Nalsar, they have a dedicated 1 year postgraduate diploma on animal rights. And there are other organizations and animal law, and there are other organizations that will be able to help with PILs as well. Even I occasionally offer advice to someone who's interested in a PIL relating to animal welfare. So, uh, sorry, before we move to the next question, like everything else, the devil is in the details. Just getting a good result from the court is not enough. To truly allow the PIL to change society, you need to follow up even after the court has come up with the judgment, right? And that's what most environmental organizations and animal rights organizations in India don't do or don't have capacity to do, right? That requires constant mobilization. It's expensive, it takes a lot of money, it's not easy. Changing the system is never easy. So, when I advise clients and friends on PILs, including relating to animals, I advise them to think of it very strategically. How do you go to court? How do you get what you want from court? After you get what you want from court, how do you take what you got from court to actually get what you want in society? And that can be a multi-year, multi-strategic, multi-tactical process. It requires lawyers, it requires activists, it requires communication skills, it requires educators, and it also requires money and time.
The next question is there are a lot of videos on YouTube wherein people eat live animals. A lot of people claim that it is their food, but some others say it is cruelty towards animals. What are your views on it, sir?
Jeffy, Rose, Anthony, you asked me such a difficult question that it is impossible to answer, but let me try. My views are that it all depends on the context and culture within which uh, uh, these incidents are occurring, right? And for me, I'll sort of tell you my biases in advance. For me, I will always feel sad for a live animal that is being eaten, right? And I will always sort of feel bad that that is happening. But I am not everybody, and that is an important point to register, right? There are different people in the world, and that difference is important to recognize. And the whole point of being a rule of law constitutional order is that difference and diversity are respected and protected, right? I'm reminded of those famous lines from English legal history or English political history. I might not agree with what you say, but I will defend to death your right to say it, right? And so it becomes a bit tricky for me to force other people in a culture that finds it acceptable to do something differently. But that said, my bias will always be in support of the animal which does not have a voice, right? And therefore, I am an animal activist. But as a legal scholar, I'll say it will depend on the constitutional order. As a student of culture and politics, I'll say it will depend on the norms, values, or consensus that is politically or culturally present in that society. And we would do well as animal activists to constantly represent the voice of the uh, sort of voiceless animal. I mean, just as a thought experiment, when a crocodile eats a human being that is alive, is that good or bad? What are my views on it? Right? Here I'll feel sad for the human being that's being eaten. So it cuts both ways, except that too many animals don't eat too many human beings. Though now with the viri, we are seeing a different kind of attack that has turned the tide on humanity.
So, what do you think if the laws relating to animals or general human behavior towards animal cruelty lethargic in India when it is compared to Western countries?
Um, I'll say yes and no. So again, it's a mixed answer, Madhur Ravi. I think in India in general, maybe it's not the laws, but within the culture and as you saw within the constitution, there is a genuine acknowledgement of the value of animal life, right? And in some quote unquote Western countries, I would actually separate out the countries. Uh, this acknowledgement of the value of human life itself is not, acknowledgement of the value of animal life itself is not registered in the law, right? So in that sense, I wouldn't place Indian law as particularly shabby or bad, especially after Justice Radhakrishnan's remarkable judgments, right? He has really, and therefore I would encourage folks who are interested to look up the seminar issue in which I have a piece called Law's Nature, where I've evaluated his judgments rather carefully. Now, so I think we are doing okay in the comparison business, but I think India as a country has so many issues of violence and has so much inequality, poverty, and suffering that quite often the suffering of animals uh, gets ignored, or some people even respond incorrectly, I would say, with uh, Arey, what are you worried about the animal? That human being there is lying like an animal, right? And these are interesting comments from a theoretical perspective to get into, right? Why is it that uh, we take seriously the suffering of human beings? Why do we take seriously the suffering of some kinds of animals like the elephant or dogs or cats, particularly pedigree dogs or cats? But we don't take so seriously the suffering of wild boar or hyena or insects like the mosquito is an animal, right? So I think one needs to break the animal down into there is no the animal, right? As Derrida famously said, it's the animals, right? And each animal deserves its own story. So I hope I answered you. Our laws are not particularly bad. Our implementation is not particularly good. And on the whole, there is a decent amount of animal cruelty in India. Right? That said, we certainly don't compare to the kind of mechanized food farming practices that are operational in some states within the US, for example, or good parts of Germany and France as well. Right? So we simply don't kill as many animals through a conveyor belt as the US does or as France or Germany does. Right? So in that sense, there is still hope when it comes to reversing cruelty that is on its way.
I think we can take the last question for today. The last question is coming in from Purav Mehta. How do you see the laws where human freedom gets compromised when legislatures try to define the animal rights and freedom?
Thank you. So, I mean, I think this question is best answered by in and through the Jallikattu case, or similar such cultural practices of communities that by some are said to violate animal rights, right? So for me, like the start of my story, it's never simple, right? And anyone who tells you that Jallikattu is a simple practice of animal rights violation, for me, is wrong. Right? There is a lot more going on there, and my partner today was just showing me a interesting book, which maybe I'll show you as well. It's, I don't know how visible it is. That's Radhika Govindrajan's Animal Intimacies, Beastly Love in the Himalayas. And just for the serious lawyers and law students, that's the go-to reference book on animal law in India, edited by Menaka Gandhi, Raj Punjwani, and Ozair Hussain. Animal Laws of India by Universal in its sixth edition. Uh, so I think it's complicated, Purav. That is the infringement of a community or a individual's right and the infringement of an animal right quite often are happening together. And I would argue that that per se needs to be recognized. And we do have within constitutional law theory sophisticated ways of balancing, sophisticated tests of reasonableness, sophisticated ways of thinking about proportionality, right? Unfortunately, what happens in India most often is we just come up with ban, no ban, right? We don't get into the sophisticated constitutional theory of what is a proportional ban, what is the purpose behind the ban, does the ban achieve the purpose that's desired, is it necessary, right? These are the standard steps of constitutional proportionality analysis that is a part of global constitutional law. And erudite judges of the Supreme Court of India and the High Courts of India have recognized and invoked these in cases, including in, let's say, your decision on privacy rights or your Nas Foundation case, right? But the norm generally in animal issues is ban, no ban, right? Which is not sophisticated. So, having answered in that general way, I'll give you my biased answer again, which is given that we have destroyed so many species of animals and devastated so many actual animals in history, I would be okay with some human rights being curtailed if we can remedy the injustice we have done to the animal world. So I am again speaking on behalf of the animals.
I think with this we can end the session, sir. We are very privileged to have you with us today. I would like to thank you on behalf of the entire team of Law Essentials for taking out your valuable time for conducting this wonderful webinar. I hope everyone has enjoyed this enriching session.
Thank you, sir. I have to thank you and your fabulous team for inviting me and for organizing this. And thanks to everyone who participated. Apologies if I got you the wrong way on your politics, but I hope at least I provoked some thinking.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all for attending the session.